The helicopter that brought her in didn't want to be there. I remember that more than I remember her face at first. The 60 came up the Sarwin Valley in the last hour of light, nose down against a wind that was already turning mean off the peaks, and the pilot set it on our little shelf of gravel for about as long as it takes a man to spit. The ramp wasn't even all the way down when the crew chief started waving people off. 2 ammo cans, a water blivet we'd begged for, a mail sack, and 1 shooter with a long rifle case slung across her back, and a ruck that looked heavier than she was. Then the bird was gone, clawing back down the valley, and the quiet came back the way it does at altitude, that big, thin, ringing quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. We were 9,000 feet up in a country that did not care about us. A little over 100 of us strung along a ridge the maps called nothing and we called the anvil, and we had been promised air and gotten instead 1 woman with a rifle. I was standing at the edge of the shelf with Prout and Vane, and I heard Prout laugh before I even turned around. "That's it," he said. "That's the reinforcement." She was maybe 40 meters off, walking up the slope toward us at a pace that didn't hurry and didn't drag, and she was reading the ground as she came. I noticed that. Most people coming off a bird into a new place look at the people. She looked at the dirt, at the ridgelines, at the way the light was falling into the valley below us, and only last of all at us. She was not young. That surprised me too. Weathered face, gray coming into the hair she had pulled back under a watch cap. The kind of stillness in her that you usually only see in men who have been doing this a very long time and have stopped needing to prove it to anybody. "Chief Reeves," she said when she reached us. Not a question, just her name laid down flat, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to drop. "Kessler," I said. I didn't offer more. I'd been the senior gun on this ridge for 3 weeks, and before that on 4 other ridges, and I had learned to hold my welcome until I knew what a person was worth. "You're our overwatch." "That's the tasking." Prout was still grinning. He was 26 and he shot well, and he had never once in his life doubted that he was the most dangerous man in any room, which is a thing that happens to men who are good young. "Ma'am," he said, "no offense, but we asked for a platoon and a gun run. We got mail and a school teacher." She looked at him the way you'd look at weather. Not angry, just registering it, the way you register a front coming in that you'll have to deal with later. "You got what could get through the pass before it closed," she said. "The pass is closed now." That landed a little because it was true. The weather had been shutting the valley down a notch a day for a week. But Prout didn't like being right-sized in front of the others, and there were others now. A dozen guys had drifted over the way men do when something new comes off a helicopter, and half of them were already smiling because Prout was smiling, and it's easier to laugh than to think. "Let me see the tool at least," Prout said, and before she could answer he reached out and lifted the rifle case off her back by its strap. It was a small thing. It's a small thing to write down, but there's a language to it that anybody who has carried a weapon into hard country understands. You do not touch another shooter's rifle. Not without asking, and not ever like that, hooking it off a person's shoulder like you're taking a tray from a busboy. It said everything Prout wanted it to say, which was, "Whatever you are, you're not one of us, and this is a toy I'm allowed to pick up." She let him take it. That surprised me most of all then. She didn't grab for it. She just watched him, hands loose at her sides, while he unzipped the case right there on the gravel and hauled the rifle out into the last of the light. It was a big gun. A bolt gun, long and heavy, a serious optic riding it, the finish worn down to gray metal along every edge where 1,000 days of hands and slings and rock had rubbed it. Prout hefted it, and I watched him clock the weight and the length and decide, wrongly, that he understood it. "Look at this cannon," he said to the crowd. He worked the bolt rack, and the metal sound of it went out flat across the shelf, and a couple of the younger guys laughed. Then he found the data book zipped into the case's flap, a fat little weather-swollen notebook held shut with a rubber band, and he pulled it out and flipped it open and read off the top of a page in a high, mocking voice, the voice you'd use to read a child's homework. 2200 minus .5 mil for the drift, favor left edge. He looked up, grinning. 2200 what, sweetheart, feet. You planning to hit the moon? Meters, she said. The laugh that went around the circle then was the ugly kind. I'll own my part in it. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop it either, and there's not much daylight between those two things when you're the senior man and the men are watching you to know what's allowed. 2200 meters. That's a mile and a third. That's a number you say to be funny. Nobody makes that shot. I had 31 confirmed, and I was proud of a 900-meter kill I'd made in a canyon 2 years back, and I'd told the story of it more times than I should have. 2200 meters was not shooting. It was a punch line. Boys, Prout said, warming up, playing the crowd now, who's got money? I'll put 50 American that the schoolteacher can't hold a plate at 800. 8, not 2200. 8. Hands went up. Bills came out. It became, in about 90 seconds, a thing, a wager, a show, the whole tired ceremony men billed to make themselves feel big at somebody else's expense. And she stood in the middle of it, unhurried, and let it happen around her like a rock lets water go by. Only once did she move. When Prout, still grinning, still working the bolt on her rifle like a kid with a stick, let the muzzle drift across the line of men as he turned, she stepped in, put one flat hand on the barrel and pushed it down toward the dirt. Gentle, not a snatch, just down until it was pointed at the ground where a muzzle belongs. Don't sweep the line, she said, quiet. It wasn't a plea and it wasn't a threat. It was the voice of someone who has buried people and does not intend to bury more over a bad joke. Prout's grin flickered just for a second, because even he knew she was right about that. Then he covered it with a bigger grin and handed the rifle back, case and book and all. Whatever you say, Chief, he said. And the way he said Chief made it another joke, and the men laughed again, and the show was over. She took the rifle. She zipped the book back into the flap. She slung the case, adjusted the ruck, and asked me, not Prout, one question. Where do you want your eyes? I pointed, mostly to be done with her, at the north spur, a long finger of rock that ran out from our ridge and looked down into the whole bowl of the valley, the village of Colling small and gray at the bottom, the far wall rising up to a saddle we called the Notch. It was exposed and cold and a long walk from the rest of us, which is exactly why I sent her there. I told myself it was tactical. It was mostly that I didn't want her near the fire. That'll do, she said, like I'd offered her something instead of gotten rid of her. And she turned and walked out the spur alone into the failing light, and I watched her go and thought, mail, a water can, and a schoolteacher. God help us. I did not know yet that I was watching the best shooter I would ever see in my life walk out to save every one of us. I want to be honest about that. I want to be honest about all of it, because I've told this story a few times now, and every time I'm tempted to make myself a little smarter at the start than I was. I wasn't smart. I was proud, and I was tired, and I looked at a woman with gray in her hair and a heavy rifle, and I saw everything except what she was. That was the first night. Nothing happened the first night, which is its own kind of information if you're paying attention, and I wasn't. The valley was too quiet. I'd been in enough bad places to have the feeling and not trust it, the way you learn not to trust every twist in your gut or you'd never sleep at all. But the Sarwin had 140 families in Colling below us, and for 3 weeks there had been goats and cook smoke and kids on the paths and the ordinary noise of people living. And the day the bird brought Reeves in, the village had gone still. No smoke, no goats, the paths empty. When a village empties around you in that country, it is not because the people have somewhere better to be. It is because they know something is coming, and they do not want to be standing next to you when it does. I walked the line that evening after chow, checking positions, and I ended up out toward the base of the north spur with my coffee going cold in my hands, looking out at the dark where she was. There was no light from her hide, a good sign if I'd let it be one. I could just make out, if I knew where to look, a low shape against the rocks where she'd built up a position. Not a lot, just enough. A rifle rest of stacked flat stones, and a bit of burlap the color of the ground broken up over the top of it, so the line of the barrel wouldn't read against the sky. "You always work alone," I called out low. For a second I thought she hadn't heard or wouldn't answer. Then, out of the dark, "When the ground's like this." I came up the last few meters and crouched at the edge of her position, and I saw she had the data book open on her knee and a red-lensed light no bigger than a thumb clipped to the brim of her cap, and she was writing. Not resting. Working. There was a laser rangefinder set into the rocks beside her, and a little weather meter on a lanyard, and she had been out here for 2 hours in the cold doing the least glamorous thing a shooter can do, which is math. "Ranging in the dark?" I asked. "Ranging while it's still," she said. "Wind lies down at night, comes up with the sun. I want the numbers before the air starts moving." She turned the book toward me, not to show off, I understood that later, but because I'd asked, and she answered questions with facts. Down the page were rows in a small hard hand. Landmarks I recognized from the daylight: the mosque wall in Kalang, the dry ford, the 3 big rocks below the notch that we called the molars, the lip of the saddle itself. Beside each one a distance, ranged and confirmed, and beside the distance a firing solution, a dope, an elevation and a windage hold worked out cold, in advance. For a shot she had no orders to take and, as far as any of us believed, no ability to make. The notch at the top of her page, underlined once, 2,190 meters. I looked at that number and I felt the first small cold finger of doubt about my own doubt. Not belief, just doubt about the doubt. Because a person who was a joke did not come out alone into the freezing dark and range every terrain feature in the valley and build a solution for the far saddle a mile and a third away. A person did that because they intended, if it came to it, to reach that saddle. And they only intended it if they had done it before. "You really think you can hit the notch?" I said, not quite a question. She capped her pen. She looked out at the dark valley for a moment, and when she spoke it wasn't a boast. It was almost gentle, the way you'd correct someone you decided not to be angry at. "I think," she said, "that tomorrow or the next day there are going to be men on that saddle with a gun that can reach your whole ridge, and your whole ridge can't reach them. And when that happens, somebody's going to wish the schoolteacher had done her homework." She nodded at the book on her knee. "So I did my homework." I didn't have anything to say to that. I sat with her a while longer, both of us quiet, the cold coming up out of the rock into my legs. At some point I said, because it had been eating at me, "Prout shouldn't have touched your gun." "No," she agreed, "he shouldn't have." A pause. "He'll learn it or he won't, not my job to teach him tonight." "You could have made a thing of it." "I've buried better men than the one I'd have been if I'd made a thing of it," she said. And there was, under the flatness, something old and worn smooth and very tired in the way she said it. And I understood that I was sitting next to a person who had spent a whole life being underestimated and had come out the far side of caring. She wasn't proving anything to Prout. She wasn't proving anything to me. She had stopped needing to prove things to anybody a long time ago, and all that was left was the work, and she did the work. I went back to the line and I did not sleep well. I told myself it was the cold. It came the next afternoon, in the flat gray light of a sky that had lowered all day. And it came the way these things always come, all at once, out of a stillness, so that the first second of it doesn't feel real. A single shot from the far wall, and then the whole world tore open. They had been moving into position all night and all morning, patient, in the folds of ground where we couldn't see, and they had done it well. When they opened up, it was from 3 sides at once, from the terraced fields below Kalang, from the ravines off our left flank, and from the high ground across the valley, the saddle and the molars and the whole rock face under the notch. Machine gun fire came across the bowl in long ropes, red where the tracers cooked through the gray light, and rounds walked up the ridge and cracked overhead and smacked into the rocks around our positions with a sound like a hammer on stone, over and over, faster than a man can count. I got low. Everybody got low. That first minute is all noise and dirt, and the animal work of getting behind something hard, and I did it on instinct, the way you're trained. And around me the ridge came alive with our own guns answering, the flat bark of our rifles and the deeper cough of our machine guns, and men shouting ranges and directions. But I knew inside of 90 seconds that we were in trouble, and it was the worst kind. It was the arithmetic kind. There were a lot of them, far more than we'd been told, far more than 100 odd of us could hold off indefinitely on a bare ridge with the ammunition we had. And they had the high ground on the far wall, that saddle, the notch, and they had gotten a heavy machine gun up onto it, a big belt-fed thing. And the moment it opened up I understood exactly what Reeves had told me in the dark. It could reach us. Its rounds came the whole way across the valley and raked the length of our ridge, and it did not have to be accurate to be deadly, because it could just hose the top of the anvil back and forth and sooner or later find flesh. And we could not reach it back. It was too far. Our guns didn't go that far. My proud 900-meter kill was a child's throw against that distance. That gun was better than a mile away, up on rock, and it was going to kill us at its leisure, and there was not one thing on that whole ridge that could touch it. Except one. I heard the call go out over the net, our ground commander's voice tight and fast, Master Chief Bauer, a big quiet man I'd trust with my life, and did. Anvil, we are troops in contact, 3 sides. We have a heavy on the high saddle across the valley grid. Anybody, I say again, anybody with range to that gun, get on it now, it's cutting us apart. And a woman's voice came back on the net. Calm, flat. The calmest voice on the whole net, calmer than the fight, so calm it made the hair stand up on my arms. Bauer, Kestrel, I have the saddle. Give me your gun's location so I don't shoot over your heads. There was a half-second of dead air. I was flat behind a boulder near the base of the North Spur with rounds cracking off the rock above me, and even then, I felt the net go still. That little silence of a lot of men all thinking the same thought at the same time. Kestrel. I want you to understand what that name meant, because I didn't fully, not in that first second. I only knew it the way you know a rumor. But Bauer knew, and half the older shooters on that ridge knew. And Master Chief Bauer's voice, when it came back, had changed. It had gone from the tight, fast voice of a man losing a fight to something quieter and steadier, the voice of a man who has just remembered he has a card in his hand he forgot he was holding. Kestrel, Bauer said. You're they, he stopped himself. Understood. My gun's the muzzle flash off the center knob I'll mark. Saddle's all yours, everybody off Kestrel's freak. Give her the air. And out on the North Spur, alone, a woman I had called a school teacher in my own head 20 hours before settled a heavy rifle into a rest of stacked flat stones, opened a weather-swollen notebook to a page she'd filled in by red light in the freezing dark, and went to work on a target a mile, and a third away that no one else in that valley could even reach. I rolled to the edge of my boulder where I could see the spur, and I watched her. She wasn't hurrying. That's the thing I have never been able to explain right to people who weren't there. The whole ridge was coming apart. Rounds were walking up and down the anvil. Our guys were screaming for ammo and for corpsemen. That heavy on the saddle was chewing us up a foot at a time. And out on the North Spur, the one person who could do anything about it was moving like a woman checking a roast. She had her cheek down on the stock. She reached up once and turned a dial on the top of her scope, clicking in the come-up she'd already worked out. I understood later, the elevation for 2,100-some meters that she'd written in her book before any of this started. She licked a finger and held it up for half a second, reading a wind she'd been tracking since dawn. She waited. She waded through a burst that kicked grit off the rocks not 4 feet from her hide, and she did not flinch, and she did not fire. What's she doing? Vane hissed next to me. He'd crawled up beside my boulder somewhere in the last minute. Shoot. Shoot the gun, shoot it. She's waiting for the wind to lie back down between gusts, I heard myself say, and I don't know how I knew it, except that I'd sat next to her in the dark and watched her range the still air, and some part of me had already started to understand her better than I wanted to. Then she fired. I didn't hear the shot the way you hear a shot up close. At that range you don't. What I saw was the muzzle lift, and a half-second of nothing, and then, a mile and a third away, up on that saddle, in the middle of that hammering machine gun, the gun stopped. Just stopped. The rope of tracers that had been sawing across our ridge went dark, and where the gunner had been there was suddenly nothing firing at all. Vane made a sound I'd never heard a grown man make. She worked the bolt. One smooth stroke, the case flicking away, and she was back down on the stock. She let a breath out. She waited again, 3 seconds, 4, and fired again. And across the valley, the man who'd crawled up to take the dead gunner's place at that heavy machine gun went down over it, and the gun stayed silent. 2 shots, 2 men, 2,100 meters. In under a minute she had taken the one weapon in that valley that could kill all of us and turned it into a piece of dead metal on a rock, and she had done it with a rifle that a boy had held up as a joke the evening before. The net was not quiet anymore. It was the opposite. Bauer's voice came through hot. Guns down, the heavies DOWN, all elements the saddle gun is down. And a ragged cheer went along the ridge even in the middle of all that fire, because men who a second before had been doing the arithmetic of their own deaths had just watched one column of that arithmetic get erased. And I lay there behind my rock, and I felt something turn over in my chest that I am not too proud to name. It was shame. Clean, cold shame. I had looked at that person and seen a schoolteacher. Prude had racked her rifle like a toy and read her lifework out loud in a baby voice while I stood there and let it happen. And now that same rifle and that same lifework were the only reason Prude was going to see the sun go down. I found out her name that day, her real name, and what the call sign meant. Bauer told me later in pieces, and the older shooters filled in the rest, and I've put it together since. Chief Petty Officer Delia Reeves, Kestrel. She had been shooting long range for the community since before Prude could drive. She held records people quoted at schools they'd never let her teach at because she outranked the instructors in the only way that counted. And the high-angle mountain program, the doctrine, the dope tables, the very way we were all taught to shoot up and across thin cold air at altitude, a good part of it had her fingerprints on it. Half the men on that ridge who thought they knew how to shoot in the mountains knew it because of work she'd done and never once bragged about. She had trained the trainers who trained us. She had, in the most literal sense, taught us how to do the thing we were now failing to do without her. The school teacher. God forgive me, she was exactly a school teacher. We were the class. But the fight was not over, and the saddle gun was only the beginning of what she did that day. Because knocking out the heavy didn't lift the siege. It just kept us alive to keep fighting it. They still had us on 3 sides, still had the numbers, and now that they'd lost their big gun they got angry and they got smart, and they started pushing, working fire teams up the ravines on our left, trying to close the distance so their numbers could tell, trying to get in among us where a mile-long rifle is no better than a pistol, and their count of bodies would grind us down. And this is the part I most want people to understand about her, because the 2 shots on the saddle are the part that sounds like a movie, and the next 4 hours are the part that was actually the work. She did not just make miracle shots. She read the whole battle from that spur like a woman reading a page, and she took it apart in the exact order it needed to come apart. There was a mortar crew. I never even saw them. She found them, tucked in a fold behind the molars, dropping rounds onto our line, and she reached across the valley and killed the man dropping the rounds down the tube, and then killed the man who ran to take his place, and the mortar went quiet and stayed quiet. There was a spotter up on a rock ledge with a radio, coordinating the pushes on our flanks, calling our positions to the men in the ravines, and she found him and ended him, and their pushes went ragged and blind. There was a crew-served gun they tried to bring up onto a terrace below calling to enfilade our left, and she killed it before it fired 10 rounds. The gunner, then the assistant, then the ammo bearer who tried to drag the gun back into cover. 1, 2, 3. So fast and so far that the men on our left flank just watched a threat that should have flanked and killed them simply cease to exist. She was not shooting men exactly. I came to see it, lying there watching the fight bend around her work. She was shooting the enemy's ability to think. Every time they built something, a base of fire, a command node, a crew that could hurt us, she reached across a mile and a third of thin gray air and unbuilt it, calmly, one round at a time, until the whole coordinated machine that had almost killed us in the first 10 minutes was just a lot of angry men in ravines with no eyes and no big guns and no plan. And our own shooters, freed up, started to make them pay for every meter. I got up off my rock. I got in the fight, the near fight, the ravines on the left where they were close enough for me to matter, and I did my job, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it well, because I did. But every one of us on that ridge knew, the way you know the ground you're standing on, that we were fighting inside a shield somebody else was holding up. Twice that afternoon I had a man in my sights in a ravine below me, and watched a fold of rock 100 meters past him puff dust, and a different man fold up, a man I hadn't seen, a man who was working around to a spot where he could have killed 3 of us, gone before I even knew he was a threat. She was seeing the whole board. She was seeing my blind spots from a mile away and covering them while I covered the thing in front of my nose and thought I was the reason we were winning. The gusts came up hard in the middle of the afternoon, the way she'd told me they would, the wind rising off the peaks and pouring down the valley, and I watched. I made myself watch between my own work, and I saw her adjust. Saw her read a flag of dust off a distant ridge, saw her hold off the edge of a target to let the wind carry the round home, saw her miss once, the only miss I ever saw her make, a round that kicked rock a foot left of a running man, and saw her correct in the space between heartbeats and put the next one exactly where the first one should have gone. She wasn't magic. That was the thing. Prout's schoolteacher joke had a nasty little truth hiding inside it that he never meant. She was a teacher, and what she was doing out there was not luck and not magic, but the patient, unglamorous, ferociously hard skill of a person who had done her homework every day for 30 years while men laughed at her for it. Late in the day, they made their last real push, and it was aimed at her. They'd figured it out by then, that the spur was the problem, that the one gun taking them apart was way out on that north finger of rock, alone. And they put men on it. A squad's worth, working up the back of the spur through the dead ground where she couldn't depress her big rifle to reach them, coming to do to her what men had wanted to do to her. I think, her whole life, to getting close where her skill couldn't save her and end her with numbers. Bauer saw it. I saw it. The net lit up, and there was a stretch of maybe 90 seconds where I flat out ran along the ridge and out onto the base of the spur with Vane and 2 others, lungs burning at that altitude, to get to her before they did. And I remember thinking with a kind of sick clarity that after everything she'd done, I was going to get there and find her dead, killed up close by cowards while she was busy saving the rest of us at distance. We didn't find her dead. We came around the last shoulder of rock onto her position and found her up on one knee, the big rifle down and a carbine up. She'd had it slung the whole time. Of course she had. She'd planned for exactly this. And there were men down on the slope below her hide, close, and she was working them with the short gun as calm as she'd worked the saddle at a mile. And when we came up on her flank and added our guns to hers, the push just broke. It came apart on the rocks below the spur, and the survivors went back down into the dead ground and did not come again. She looked at us, at me, over the top of her smoking carbine, and there was no "I told you so" in it. There wasn't anything in it but a shooter checking that her flank was covered now. "Took your time," she said, not a barb, almost a kindness, almost a joke, the first and only one I ever heard her make. "Yes, ma'am," I said, "we did." The air came back at last light. The weather that had trapped us broke enough near dusk for the birds to get up the valley, and when the first gun run went in on the far wall, you could feel the whole ridge exhale. After that, it was just cleanup, and the long, cold count of what it had cost. We had lost people. I won't dress that up. Good men who'd been alive that morning weren't, and no shooting, however perfect, brings them back, and Reeves knew that better than any of us. I saw her face when the count came over the net, and for just a second the flatness cracked and I saw what it cost her, all of it, every name, and then she closed it up again and went back to work, because that was who she was. But there were 101 of us who walked off that ridge who would not have. I've done the arithmetic more times than is healthy. The heavy on the saddle alone would have killed a dozen or more before dark, and once it had thinned us the pushes would have gotten in, and once they'd gotten in the numbers would have done the rest. And there is a version of that day, the likely version, the version that was coming true minute by minute, until a woman on a spur started unmaking it, where a relief force flies up the Sarwin 2 days later and finds the anvil the way you find those places in the stories nobody wants to tell. She changed that, one shooter. She changed everything, exactly the way the doubt in me had insisted no one person ever could. I found Prout near the aid post at dusk. He had a wound in his shoulder, not bad, and he was sitting against a rock with his arms strapped up, and he was quiet in a way I'd never seen him quiet. He'd watched the whole thing from the left flank. He'd watched, I found out, a man get killed 40 meters short of the corpsman working on him, a man who'd have flanked and killed that corpsman and the 2 wounded under his hands, killed by a round that came from a mile away, from the spur from her. When she came in off the spur at last, the big rifle over her back in its worn case again, walking up the slope at that same unhurried pace, reading the ground, tired to the bone, the ridge went quiet the way it had gone quiet the first evening she'd stepped off the bird. But it was a different quiet. The first one had been contempt dressed up as a joke. This one had the weight of 101 men in it, and not one of them was laughing. Prout got up. It cost him with the shoulder, and I moved to help him and he waved me off. He walked out into the open where she'd have to pass, and the whole ridge watched, because everyone knew what he'd done the night before and everyone was waiting to see what he'd do now. He stopped in front of her. He was a foot taller than she was, and he came to attention, a real one, the kind you don't fake, spine straight and chin level and eyes front, and he held it. And his voice when it came out was not the high mocking voice from the gravel the evening before. It was a boy's voice, cracked down the middle. "Chief," he said, "I had you wrong, I had you all the way wrong. And he couldn't finish it and he didn't have to." She looked at him a long moment. She could have broken him. She had every right and every reason and the whole ridge behind her, and she could have said one word and left him small on that mountain forever, and God knows a lesser person would have, and I'd have cheered. She didn't. She reached out and set her hand on his good shoulder. Once, the same flat, steady hand she'd used to push a rifle muzzle down toward the dirt the night before, not to shame, just to set a thing where it belonged, and she said, quiet enough that only those of us close could hear it, "You held your flank when it counted. That's the part that matters, the rest you'll learn." A pause. "Get that shoulder looked at." And she walked on past him toward the aid post to see about the wounded, because there were wounded, and she was, under everything, exactly what Prout had called her. A person whose whole life had been about the thing you do after the shooting, which is take care of your people and pass on what you know so that fewer of them die next time. I never saw her again after that valley. She rotated out or up, or wherever they send the ones who are that far past needing to prove anything, and I stayed in the fight another few years, and I made some shots I'm proud of and lost some friends I'm not done grieving. But I will tell you the truest thing I know, and I've earned the right to say it, because I was the proudest gun on that ridge, and I was the one who sent her out to the cold spur alone to be rid of her. I thought I knew what a shooter was. I thought I was one. Then I watched a woman with gray in her hair, whose rifle a boy had racked like a toy, whose life's work a boy had read out loud in a baby voice, sit alone in the cold and do her homework and then reach across 1.33 miles of thin gray air and hold 101 men in the palm of her hand and carry us home. We had asked for a platoon and a gun run. We got Kestrel, And to the end of my days, when some young hard charger tells me he's the best gun in the room, I will think of a school teacher on a spur, and I will keep my mouth shut, and I will thank God that on the worst day of my life I was wrong about the most important person on that mountain.